Good afternoon, everyone. We are here to look at a panel that explore key social influences on young people's crime and substance use, families, neighborhoods, and schools through the lens of situational action theory. My name is Mandy Lau, and I am a research associate on the PAT study based at the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge. And I will be talking about a meta-analysis of disadvantage in crime. I will introduce each of the speakers one by one after I've given my first talk. So without further ado, I'm going to start. Does a lack of social and economic resources cause people to commit crime? This is a fascinating topic that criminologists and the general public have discussed and debated very widely. I will present the findings from the meta-analysis of recent studies on the relationship between social disadvantage and crime. In recent years, meta-analysis has actually become a very popular technique because it allows us to summarize statistical information across different studies. And by conducting a meta-analysis, it will allow us to clarify the strength of the relationship between disadvantage and crime. For both criminologists and researchers and practitioners alike, this is a very important question to address because depending on how strong this relationship is, there may be different research directions and also intervention strategies that practitioners could engage with offenders and antisocial young people. Now, if there is a strong relationship, we may think that there may be a more direct cause from social disadvantage to crime. But if this relationship is only weak, we would suggest that there will be a more indirect role of social disadvantage in crime causation. And we know that this meta-analysis is situated within the situational action theory, which hypothesizes that social disadvantage is an indirect cause of the causes of crime. And so based on the SAT perspective, we will actually hypothesize a weak relationship between disadvantage and crime. It will be interesting to see whether we will have evidence to support this suggestion. The relationship between deprivation and crime can be considered a criminological puzzle. Robert Sampson had stated that everybody believes that poverty causes crime, it seems. In fact, I've heard many senior sociologists express frustration as to why criminologists would waste time with theories outside the poverty paradigm. And the reason that we do is that the facts demand it. There is some evidence that calls for renewed attention in this topic. For example, there are a number of reviews which showed a weak association between social class and delinquency. Tittle and colleagues in the 70s had examined 35 studies on social class and criminality, and they found a weak relationship of minus 0.09 between social class and criminality. And similarly, recently, Piotrowska and colleagues in 2015 also found, looking at 132 studies, that there is a similar weak effect between socioeconomic status and antisocial behaviour in young people and adolescents. Now, although Piotrowska and colleagues had conducted a fairly recent review, they have actually measured antisocial constructs that are much broader and included terms such as irritability and callous emotional traits in their search terms. And within the PATS and the SAT, we would like to include and review studies that have more specific measurable acts of crime, which means that we would like to carry out a more updated piece of work. To further illustrate the criminological puzzle, I have taken some findings from the PATS Plus project. And here, if we look at the most disadvantaged families, which form the top 40% of disadvantaged families, there are 274 young people who have low SES. And we also know that there are about 27 of young people who we could call persistent offenders, meaning that they have self-reported more than 100 crimes over 12 to 16 years. And what we're interested in is the part where the disadvantaged families and persistent offenders intersect. So here we know that there are 19 young people who can be considered both from disadvantaged families and being persistent offenders. And what do these 19 young people represent? We know that looking at the 19 young people in relation to the small circle of 27 persistent offenders, it forms 70%, meaning that 70% of persistent offenders actually are from disadvantaged backgrounds. But if we look at the 19 young people in relation to the more disadvantaged families, we know that only 7% of young people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds are persistent offenders. So the uncolored section of the larger circle means that 93% of young people from disadvantaged families don't commit crime persistently. And sometimes practitioners may have this bias that lots of persistent offenders may be caused to commit crime because of disadvantage, and that's because they may come into direct contact with a lot of persistent offenders. They're seeing this 70% out of the 27 young people. So to summarize, although most persistent offenders come from disadvantaged backgrounds, most people from disadvantaged backgrounds don't actually become persistent offenders. Now, some of the complexity in defining social disadvantage refers to the fact that there are lots of preconceptions about what disadvantages refers to. And if you look at the media images online, people from poverty backgrounds may be characterized by a chaotic family life, and also you often see images of people who are from a particular ethnicity living in social housing. But in the PATS and the SAT framework, we try to define social disadvantage in a more objective way, which means that we focus on the comparative lack of social and economic resources. There are a number of synonymous terms that researchers use to refer to deprivation or disadvantage, such as socioeconomic status, poverty, and deprivation. And there are also some common indicators, such as income, education, and occupational class. In our review, we exclude constructs. Okay. So in our review, we exclude constructs such as race, perceived disadvantage, and relative deprivation because we consider these as deviating from our definition of disadvantage. But this isn't to say that they may not have a role in crime causation. We are just, it's just beyond the scope of the review for us to examine these. And one of the reasons that it may be difficult to study the relationship between disadvantage and crime is that disadvantage tends to be measured at different levels. So here, this diagram illustrates that some studies could measure disadvantage in individual level, and that could be situated within neighborhood, city, or the countries. And in the review, we focus on the individual and neighborhood level disadvantages. We also argue that individual or family disadvantages and neighborhood disadvantages are separate constructs. And we have some evidence from the PATS data showing that there's a moderate positive correlation between family and neighborhood disadvantage, which means that we decided to analyze the data for family and neighborhood disadvantages separately. So in this review, we wanted to establish the strength of disadvantage and crime separately for family and neighborhood disadvantages. We also wanted to explore the theoretical and methodological factors that may influence the relationship, such as gender, age, the type of informant for disadvantage and crime, and the type and informant for, no, I've already said that. And again, the analysis was conducted for family and neighborhood disadvantages separately. One of the things that when we conduct a meta-analysis is to use a systematic review. And a systematic review is a type of literature review that involves a clear searching strategy with particular inclusion criteria. And here I have shown you what inclusion criteria that I have used to conduct my search. As I said before, this review is situated within the PATS project, so we included measures that are comparable to the PATS study. And in terms of the search terms, we have a list of words that we have included, such as SES, poverty-related terms, income, education, social class, and these are my crime search terms. And in meta-analysis, researchers tend to use a standard way of summarizing how the search was conducted. And here we can see that having searched through databases such as Criminal Justice Abstract, Cambridge Scientific Abstract, etc., we have identified over 22,000 records. And following removing duplicate records and screening articles, we have finally resulted in 254 full-text articles, and we included 42 studies in our review. So this is the exciting part of the talk, because we have some results. This is a forest plot showing the relationship between family disadvantage and crime. And on the y-axis here, we show the number of effect size across 34 studies. So there are 36 effect size in the 34 studies. And in the bottom, we have the numeric value of the effect size ranging, a bit like a correlation, ranging from -1 to 0 to +1. And 0 means weak, no correlation. And in our results, we find a correlation of 0.08, which means that it's a weak relationship between family disadvantage and crime. And if you think about the reviews that I mentioned earlier in the study, they had a negative correlation because they were looking at lower socioeconomic status being associated with higher level of delinquency, whereas I'm looking at higher level of disadvantage being associated with higher levels of delinquency, which means that we are in agreement with each other, even though the direction looks different. Again, for neighborhood disadvantage, we had very similar results. We had almost identical correlation effect of 0.08, which means again that there is a weak relationship between neighborhood disadvantage and crime. So to summarize, we found that there were persistently weak relationships between crime and family and neighborhood disadvantages respectively. And this relationship also didn't vary across the different theoretical and methodological moderators that we've tested. We did see that there were quite diverse measures in the literature looking at disadvantage, so this is something that researchers need to discuss and debate again what they mean when they talk about disadvantage. And in the review, we were only able to look at social disadvantage at one time point being related to crime at a different time point, and people from a life course perspective would suggest that disadvantage may not be a stable thing across someone's lifetime. So this calls for more interest and research into longitudinal studies, which perhaps we'll be able to address further. So coming back to the Venn diagram that we showed earlier, even though the relationship between disadvantage and crime is weak, this is actually a very persistent relationship. So what happens to these 19 young people? In the SAT perspective, we suggest that disadvantage may actually act as a cause of the causes of crime. So we are not saying that they're not relevant, but we are saying that they have a more indirect and distant role in the causal pathway of crime. And some of the implications and ideas that we can theorize from the SAT perspective may include this. So, for instance, if families are from low-income households, they may have insufficient resources for providing cognitively enriching activities for their children, and that could influence their development of executive function and self-control. And we often find that families with low occupational status may have long hours at work, which means that they have less supervision and monitoring for their children, and there may be more opportunities for these young people to go into criminogenic contexts, so such as hanging around with delinquent peers, and they may also have less time to help children to develop moral values. So to summarize, social disadvantage and crime is still something that we should pay attention to in both research and for practitioners, but we in the PATS project have a very specific framework in examining how disadvantage is a cause of the causes of crime, and we can direct your attention to further panels that explore the trajectories of crime development from there is a session tomorrow that Pio and Kyle and Gabriella will be talking about this in further details as well. Thank you. Are there any questions that we can discuss briefly before we go on to the next talk?
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. The meta-analysis, as you know, sometimes receive this criticism of oranges and lemon. And in your case, you have talked about the diversity in the measures that you have used. So my question is whether you have had time to think about which would be the way most consistent with situational action theory of defining disadvantage or defining social class, and to try to select those studies that approach more closely to that definition.
Yeah, when we developed the coding protocol, we did discuss these concepts of disadvantage in further details, and we have focused on studies that are more in agreement with how we want to define disadvantage within SAT. And we also try to analyze the study. So for example, in the subgroup analysis, we could examine the type of disadvantage such as income, education, and occupation separately with crime, and we found that this relationship was also consistently weak across the different types of disadvantage. So this gives us more confidence in the findings. And in terms of what you said about disadvantage being measured in very diverse ways, one of the more difficulties is probably with the neighborhood disadvantage, because it tends to be a composite measure of lots of different things. So some studies did use race as part of, like, percentage of black population in a particular area, for example, and we did try and discuss whether those studies were included or not. I think there is a general lack of studies that look at both family and neighborhood disadvantage, and those studies would probably help clarify, like, the relative importance and how they play different roles in crime causation in general. Does that answer your question? Yeah. If there are no more further questions, I will now pass on to the second speaker. Our second speaker is Nina-Katri Gustafsson, and she's a current postdoctorate and research associate at the PATS team, and she will be talking about the applying SAT to alcohol use. So please welcome Nina-Katri Gustafsson.
Yes. As Mandy said, am I screaming? It sounds like I'm screaming. It's not, yeah. As Mandy said, I'm a postdoc at the Institute of Criminology working on the PADS team. And I'm applying situational action theory to substance use. And this presentation is going to be about alcohol consumption. I might mention a little bit about general substance use, but the assumption is that you can actually apply situational action theory to substance use, given that substance use might also be controlled kind of by moral rules. It's in general, it's the same assumptions that is being made, but I'm using substance-genic environments and substance use propensity instead. So it might differ a little bit in relation to the general. I'm going to take this off. The concepts you're using in relation to criminology or crime. And also in this presentation, I'm focusing on gender and religion. I'm mentioning ethnicity a little bit, but I'm mainly focusing on the two first ones. A lot of literature is often looking at gender differences when it comes to substance use and alcohol use. And you also bring up that some religions might not be as likely to use substances as people with another religion. Sometimes it's also mentioned that ethnicity might matter. I would argue it's more related to the religion and the moral rules related to that. let me see, I can't see here. According to situational action theory, it's argued that these characteristics, such as gender and religion, is merely markers of the behavior. So they are not the real causes. The causes are, as you probably know by now, propensity and exposure, and the interaction between these two. And there might be differences, but it's more related to these real causes that we claim. So here I'm just applying the situational action theory in relation to these characteristics. And my working hypothesis was that if there would be alcohol consumption in this group among the young people, it would mainly be caused by propensity, exposure, and the interaction between these two. That it would be more common to use if you had high propensities or exposure. I'm just seeing if I said everything. The data, I'm not going to go into details about my analysis and data, but I'm using PADS data. And in the paper that I'm working on, I should mention also this is very preliminary results, so you should consider it as a teaser rather than any like a final result. But in the paper that I'm working on, I'm using both survey data and space-time budget data, but in this presentation I will focus on space-time budget data. And then it's rather hours than the subjects that I'm focusing on. As you can see, it's a lot of hours that has been collected in this data set for the ages 13 to 17 years old. Yeah, you can read it yourself, I'm not going to say. And I should mention also that all analysis is conducted on the hours spent awake. So, alcohol consumption in the space-time budget data is basically yes and no. Have you used alcohol in this situation? And for some analysis, I've been aggregating this to an individual level. It was just in the regression analysis that I did. And propensity is mainly measured by rules of conduct, and this is the difference. So I'm not using general crimes, but only looking at the rules related to substance use. And exposure is either if peers have been using substance use or it's included in the exposure scale, or other types of substance dietic settings, which is assumed to affect substance use. And this is very similar to the one used for crime rates, like they are unsupervised, for example. Mandy, I'm counting on you to like wave when I'm halfway through because I can't see the time at all. I was doing some descriptive analysis and also linear regression. I'm not going to go into that. You can ask me later if you wonder what I did, but this is just shortly. And in the descriptive analysis, you can see that there is no difference when it comes to alcohol use by gender. And some people might react to this and wonder what is going on, but you have to remember that this is just propensity or, not propensity, but have you used or have you not used? It's not volume of alcohol. So there might still be differences in how much they use in each situation. But regarding this result, it's actually in line with some studies on young people because they tend to drink as often as the other gender. But when it comes to religion and ethnicity, you see that there is a difference, and Muslims are very much less likely to drink alcohol than other types of religions. And the reason for me just to dichotomize it was that this group was actually standing out quite a lot from the other ones, whereas they were more similar. And the same thing with ethnicity. And I have chosen to focus on Muslim or not Muslim because Asians are actually mainly a group consisting of Pakistani, and the main religion is Islam in this group. So far in line with what I was expecting. And this is just an illustration of everyone. So I haven't divided it by a population group here. But for those of you who are familiar with the crime data, you might see that if you're exposed, the middle bar for propensity, 16.7%, is higher than the one in the corner. And this, I would argue, can be explained by that alcohol use is not breaking against the moral rules as much as crimes. So you might not, it might be that they actually, it's more accepting, and you are also fairly often exposed to it. So when I've been looking at other types of substances, hard drugs and cannabis use, it's more in line with crime rates. So this would strengthen my argument, I think. And this, I don't know if you see, but you should be able to see that the bars are kind of similar. So even if the top ones are male to the left and the females to the right. And it's basically the same pattern as you saw for the full or the whole sample. The same for other religion, which is the one on the bottom to the left. However, for Muslims, it looks a little bit different. Yeah, this is where it comes to the preliminary results. I've been wondering a little bit about this, but first of all, it's, they are not exposed to the same degree as other religions. It's also very few who are using alcohol at all in this group. So I'm not saying that this is in contrast to the theory, because it's still very few Muslims who use alcohol. And also, so that explains why you can't really see a big group being exposed. But it might also be that they are not really keen on using a lot. They might use just a little bit just to blend into groups. So they might not have a really strong propensity themselves, but they sometimes use just to blend in. But this is something I need to look at further. So bear with me. Also, when I looked at I did the regression analysis, and I should say, I didn't mention it earlier, but I haven't logged the dependent variable. And I'm not going to go into details, but it's, for those of you who went to the earlier session, it's really hard to show interaction effects when you're logging your dependent variable. However, propensity and exposure were significant in the logged ones as well, however, not the interaction effect. Religion was also significant in the earlier analysis. But to kind of back up this, I also tried it with robust standard errors, and as you can see, it's the interaction is actually significant here, so it should really be an interaction effect. Between propensity and exposure. Another thing I should point out regarding these results, it's supporting that propensity and exposure are important, but not gender. However, when it comes to religion, since I'm done soon. When it comes to religion, it's also significant, and my main argument to start with was that it would kind of be picked up by propensity and exposure. But as we can see here, it's something else going on as well, even though propensity and exposure is important. And this is something I'm thinking a little bit about, but my thoughts right now about this is that there might be something else that religion is picking up, which might actually be related to propensity and exposure, but on another level. There might be something you learn from home. Your parents are telling you, like, this is not how we do it. We are not drinking alcohol. And it might not be a strong propensity with the individual, him or herself, but something you do without really thinking too much about it. And it kind of fades into, in situational action theory, you talk about actions being like there might be rational choices, but there might also be habitual choices, and it might actually fade into that it's something you have kind of learned from home, and you're not really thinking about it. It's not really a habit, but it's kind of intertwining together there. What I was going to say about this is I'm arguing that what we see with in relation to religion is actually about the perception choice process. We might not pick it up with the items we have on propensity, but there might be something that they don't even consider it as a choice to use alcohol. It's in that dark hole that I'm thinking we might be able to find the explanation. The preliminary conclusions is that the key concepts of SAT is in fact important, and we can see this pattern in most groups except for Muslims, but they were also a very tiny group, and we need to remember that. What is also strengthening that the key concepts are important is that there are, in fact, few Muslims drinking at all. And as I said, the regression analysis suggests that there might be something else also explaining why they don't drink, learned behavior or something in the culture. And I'm claiming that it might be related to perception choice process. But I need to look into this further. So, yeah, I'm done. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Does anyone want to ask any questions in relation to this talk? Beth?
Yeah, for them.
Hey, it's more of a comment, really, Nina. Thank you. The graphs you showed with the crimes per 1,000 hours and the interaction, where you had the gender to the male and female at the top and the religion at the bottom, and you were pondering on the Muslim result you showed.
Yeah.
The scale of the graph was very different.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you actually put the same scale, I think the Muslim group was only 0.1 crime per 1,000 hours, whereas the other graphs were, for the high propensity groups, were up to 20 crimes per 1,000 hours. So the scale is vastly different. So I think if you set the scale for that and compared like with like, essentially you could basically say it was 0.
Yeah.
And then I don't think you actually need to explain a difference. There's not really a difference there that you need to explain.
Yeah. As I said, oh, I'm screaming. As I said, it's very, very few Muslims using at all. Yeah. So it's, and I mean, even among their hours, it's hardly nothing.
Exactly.
So,
I think it's more, the bigger finding is that it's 0 or close to 0.
Yeah. Thank you. Nothing more? Then I'm leaving.
So our next speaker is Professor Gorazd Meško. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security at the University of Maribor, and he's conducted a replication longitudinal study in Slovenia called the Study of Parental Monitoring and Adolescent Delinquency. And he'll be talking about parenting in relation to substance use today.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm not dean anymore, so I stepped down a year ago. I'm a free man now. I can do research. So, okay, so let me start my presentation with thanking to PO and colleagues, because I would say it was a great honor and pleasure and a challenge for us to test some ideas in our country in Slovenian language. And as we heard in the morning when Larry Sherman was talking about the knowledge of grandmothers, their wisdom, how they know everything, you know, about nurturing kids, family, variables, etc., etc. We we try to compare common sense with these scientific findings. We first translated questionnaire from English to Slovenian language, which is one of not many languages which having singular, dual, and plural. And sometimes it's very difficult to translate some English or American or other concepts to our language. But we, I think, did a great job. After the translating the questionnaire, we tested it, and then we did data collection. We actually administered the questionnaire to 409 pupils in primary schools in Ljubljana, the capital city of Slovenia, and 409 questionnaires to students of secondary high schools. We also did interviews with many of them, so it was quite a time-consuming endeavor. So I'm going to present you some analysis from the data we collected 5 years ago. Today I will actually try to answer two research questions. Do parental instrumental control variables have any associations with the self-reported delinquency of the respondents? And second, does the level of parental instrumental control, low, medium, high, influence the self-reported delinquency rates in the samples we studied? So, just a few words about parental instrumental control. So it's actually about respondents' self-reported parental knowledge of their whereabouts, what they're doing, with whom they're socializing, and when they're not at home. And we have here 3 variables. We included them into our analysis. And let's see some differences. So I think, first of all, we have to take into consideration the age differences from development, psychological views and others, because it's obvious that the 12-year-olds reported a little bit differently to the 16-year-olds, and I would say that's normal, that is accepted and acceptable. So what is actually interesting, that there are some patterns which are changing, and it's about the parental knowledge about what they do and how they do that and so on. So here we have, again, some differences about drinking, using drugs, minor offenses, etc., etc. And we can see some differences which are very interesting for me. First of all, truancy changes significantly, and also some other patterns. And here we have also some comparison, and I would like to focus on the last two ones. So it's drinking until feeling drunk in 2010. It's a year before we collected the data. So we see that in the primary school we have 1% of girls drinking, and then in high school or this professional vocational school, 67%, and in boys it actually changed from 2.3 to 67%. So these results support somehow the results of the study, European study on binge drinking, excessive use and abuse of alcohol in 16-year-olds, where actually our youth actually won the first place in Europe. So it's not like, you know, the Premier League in football, but I think we can do something about it later on. And trying drugs. So we can see that there are some changes between the 12 and the 16-year-olds in maybe experimenting with drugs and, you know, having more experiences. So we then did correlations between those variables in the parental instrumental control and all kinds of deviant acts. I'm very grateful to Helmut, who actually advised us what to do and how to do that, because we tried with some other methods, and this actually showed us a little bit more clear picture. So we can, I would say the negative correlations actually support the idea that the less control there is, the more we have deviant acts in actually the more reported deviant acts by the teenagers. So then about alcohol consumptions, it's about the same. So one remark, so we had a very few reported self-delinquency in the group of younger respondents, so the 12-year-olds. We had a little bit more. That's actually why I'm presenting you the results for the high school, only because numbers actually were very low, figures were low. So about the same here. And so we can see that also some deviant acts, not some, but all of them negatively correlate with the lack of control. And then we decided to do this negative binomial regression only on the high school sample, because we had a very few self-reported delinquency in the 12-year-old sample. And let's see what we have here. So we had deviant acts as a dependent variable, and parental instrumental control. Actually, we tested it, how it correlates or impacts different deviant acts. And we can see that in in all the cases, we have low parental instrumental control significant, statistically significant. The medium is not significant, I think only in 2 cases, not in 3 cases. So this actually supports that low parental instrumental control has some impact on deviant acts of youngsters. So quickly, answers to the research questions. So do parental instrumental control variables have any associations with the self-reported delinquency of the respondents? I would say yes, because for the majority of cases we got statistically significant results. And the second one, does the level of parental instrumental control, low, medium, high, influence the self-reported delinquency rates? Yes. So the regression analysis actually showed in the majority of cases, actually in all cases, that low parental instrumental control is quite highly statistically significant, but there are some still dilemmas about the medium and others. So that's all for now. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions? Any remarks?
What do you think is happening if that relationship you're saying, which is a relatively small relationship, but what do you think is the mechanism behind that, especially within an SAT framework, for example?
In which case?
The relationship between, in general, the relationship between parental instrumental control, basically where parents know what their kids are up to, where they are, where they're going, and their crime and substance use outcomes.
So if I understood you correctly, I would say the first problem I see is that we asked teenagers about their experiences with their parents' control. So it's, in reality, maybe it's not like, you know, we are actually not talking about, but it's their perception of their control of their parents. Why? It's difficult to say. It's like in the morning, you know, some variables were not measured, and actually I cannot speculate at the moment, but from the data set we had, actually we got these results. But I think that it's a question of the level of explanation, and maybe we would get a little bit different picture if we would include some other variables, but within this framework, I can say that this results support the SAT theory to some extent, actually to quite a big extent.
Our final speaker is Liam McSharry. Liam is currently a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge, and he will be talking about applying situational action theory to school policies. Please welcome Liam McSharry.
Hi everybody. So today I'm going to talk about the application of situational action theory to the school setting and the hypothetical explanation of crime, of the causation of problem behaviour, the breaking of school rules, and criminal behaviour, the breaking of laws in the school setting. I'm going to talk a little bit about some general patterns about what we know about offending in schools, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we don't know and how I think situational action theory can help fill some of these gaps. So, some of the general patterns of offending and problem behaviour in schools is that a significant amount of problem and criminal behaviour does occur in schools. The rate of problem and criminal behaviour varies from school to school and from individual to individual. And also, those who are engaged in certain types of problem behaviour in school are more likely to go on and commit criminal acts outside of school and in later life. In terms of explanations in existing research, the kind of idea in existing research tends to be to identify school and individual characteristics that are associated with higher levels of problem behaviour. So external characteristics of schools include things like school location, school size, socio-demographic characteristics of pupils, and then internal characteristics, those over which schools have a little bit more control, such as their policy, psychosocial climate, staffing levels. Generally, the findings suggest that there is more problem criminal behaviour in schools that are in urban locations, in schools where there are socially disadvantaged pupils, and in schools where there's poor psychosocial climate. Now, as I see some limitations with existing research. The first problem I see is that there's an over-reliance on the use of socio-demographic characteristics as measures of individual crime propensity. As Mandy's presentation and others have suggested, these are at best weak predictors of crime involvement and are not direct causes of crime. The risk with this is that we may be overestimating or underestimating some of the difficulties school may face with the pupils they admit. The second problem is that there's confusion over the internal social processes within schools. The umbrella term seems to be school climate, but this, depending on the paper you read, this can mean different things. It can mean the pupils' perceptions of psychosocial climate, it can mean discipline policies, it can mean other things. And on top of this, while a lot of researchers identified psychosocial climate within schools as being associated with problem and criminal behaviour, very little is known about how these climates are created, nor how schools can influence them through policy and teacher actions. The third problem, which I feel is at the root of the first two problems, is that there's no mechanistic explanation of how crime and problem behaviour is caused in schools. While current research has identified some of the characteristics of schools and individuals that may be important in crime causation, it's yet to offer up and test a plausible mechanism that links different factors to crime. This is problematic as it makes it difficult to establish which of the identified characteristics are causal factors and which are just correlates or markers. Overall, these problems join up to mean that existing research is of limited use to policymakers and practitioners. Now, for me, the next step is to develop and test the next step we need to take is to develop and test a mechanistic theory of crime and problem behaviour in school causation in schools that explains why some pupils come to engage in more problem and criminal behaviour than others, why some schools come to experience higher levels of problem and criminal behaviour, and why some types of behaviour in school are associated with offending in later life. As you may have guessed from the title of the presentation, I think situational action theory can provide some compelling answers to these questions. You've heard a lot about situational action theory today and the mechanisms, so what I'm going to do is just talk about the kind of adapted mechanisms in the school context. The first mechanism I'm going to look at in the school context is the kind of the perception choice process and how that affects school levels of crime and propensity. And this brings us to hypothesis 1, that is, the rate of problem and criminal behaviour in a school will be affected positively by the crime propensity of its pupils and negatively by the school's collective efficacy. This hypothesis consists of two propositions. The first, looking at the role of the individuals in schools, is that controlling for the moral context in schools, control for the moral context. In schools where their pupils have higher crime propensities, there will be higher rates of problem and criminal behaviour. The concept of crime propensity is easily translated to the school setting, and SAT would predict that pupils whose personal conduct norms do not resemble school rules or criminal laws, or pupils who have low self-control are likely to break rules. It follows then that schools with higher numbers of pupils who are more likely to break rules will experience higher rates of problem behaviour and rule breaking. The second proposition of hypothesis 1 is that controlling for the crime propensity of pupils, there should be less problem and criminal behaviour in schools with high collective efficacy. Now, collective efficacy was conceived for the neighbourhood context, and some adaptation is necessary to make it relevant to the school setting. In schools, as in neighbourhoods, positive, respectful relationships and trust between members of the school community are important for cohesion, but there are also additional factors. Within schools, there are two distinct groups of individuals, staff and pupils, where members of staff are agents of informal and formal social control, as well as sources of social support. The explicit role of staff as agents of social control and sources of social support has some implications for the perceptions of collective efficacy for pupils and staff. Firstly, for pupils, it is important that they see teachers as legitimate agents of social control so they can form cohesive working relationships with them. In the school setting, I would argue that legitimacy is derived from school rules which are fair, clear and consistently enforced. It is also important that pupils perceive teachers as caring and supportive. School pupils are much younger on average from the residents in neighbourhoods and are at an age where they rely on emotional support from adults. As such, they look to teachers as social support, and many have suggested that pupils who perceive their teachers as supportive and caring will have better relationships with them and are less likely to engage in problem behaviour. These additional theoretical considerations have been incorporated into some of the existing conceptions of school moral context, such as communal organisation, positive school climate and authoritative school climate. Now, if hypothesis 1 is correct, and that high collective efficacy in schools can deter offending, then it's important that we understand how school collective efficacy develops and how schools can create high collective efficacy. Which brings me to hypothesis 2. That school collective efficacy will be affected negatively by socially disorganised school intakes and positively by thoughtful school policy and staff action. Proponents of collective efficacy theory suggest that neighbourhood collective efficacy is created through repeat interactions, and the outcomes of these interactions are determined by structural features of the neighbourhood. Social disorganisation, such as concentrated poverty and residential instability, can prevent the and ethnic heterogeneity, can prevent the repeated interactions that are necessary for creating behavioural norms and expectations for social control. In the school setting, this process may not be the same, as teachers are the driving force of social control, but it's theoretically possible that ethnic heterogeneity and population instability could have a negative influence on the creation of collective efficacy. And this might be one of the mechanisms that explains why there are higher levels of problem and criminal behaviour in schools with deprived and ethnically heterogeneous intakes. However, lots of research has shown that schools with similar socio-demographic characteristics have different levels of problem behaviour, so it's clear that social disadvantage is not the only influence on the creation of collective efficacy. I believe the other key influences are school policy and staff actions. School policy is both the official set of school rules and procedures relating to pupil behaviour, as defined in policy documents, and the strategies used by senior staff to ensure the delivery of policy as envisaged. This directly influences staff actions, which are the day-to-day strategies and activities used by staff in interactions with pupils and other members of staff. The separation of the two is important because, as many people who have worked in schools will know, policy on paper is not necessarily reflected in the day-to-day realities of school. To date, there is limited research examining how school policy and staff actions affect the climate or moral context within the school, although there is a considerable amount of expert opinion on the matter. An examination of the literature that does exist reveals both staff actions and school policy that theoretically should improve collective efficacy and empirically have been shown to lead to improved pupil behaviour, or experts have suggested that they should lead to improved pupil behaviour. So starting with staff action, as that's a direct influence on the social interactions that lead to collective efficacy. Staff may build positive relations by doing things like presently greeting pupils around the school, spending time with pupils outside of lessons in less formal settings such as the playground and the canteen, encouraging pupils to share problems, and by proactively approaching pupils they feel may be unhappy, and also by giving pupils responsibility. To establish and enforce behavioural norms, it's clear that consistency and communication are extremely important. Teachers in the same school should have the same behavioural expectations, and these should be communicated to pupils, especially when pupils have not met behaviour expectations. It's also important that teachers praise and reward good and exceptional conduct. To establish perceptions of social control, it's key that there are high levels of supervision around the school, particularly at break times and other times when there's a lot of movement. This can be achieved through strategically placing staff around the school. When rules are broken, it's important that teachers challenge inappropriate behaviour consistently, and having and using a continuum of consequences should help with this. The combination of high supervision and consistent consequences increase perceptions of the likelihood of sanction. However, it is important to note that over-punitive and confrontational discipline, such as shouting at pupils, zero-tolerance policies, and the overuse of suspension, are associated with increased problem behaviour and may harm cohesive relationships. Teachers may avoid unnecessary conflict and confrontations by using restorative justice to resolve issues between pupils and staff promptly. Where there has been serious or repeat rule breaking, however, it is important that teachers follow up with more serious consequences, such as contacting parents and placing pupils on report. Now, taking a step back in this process, thoughtful school policy is therefore policy which encourages and supports staff to act in the desired way. The building block for this is centrally designed, I believe, is centrally designed behaviour management, a centrally designed behaviour management scheme featuring an explicit set of behaviour expectations and a set of consequences and rewards which are clear to staff and pupils. This scheme should be consistently used across the school. With this in place, senior staff can train more junior staff in how to use the behaviour management scheme in line with school policy. Senior members of staff should then monitor the actions of other members of staff to ensure that they are managing behaviour in accordance with the school policy, and they should support members of staff who are struggling to manage behaviour. Now, hypothesis 3 looks at how individuals in schools come to have their crime propensities and suggests that schools with disadvantaged intakes will have high average levels of crime propensity among their pupils due to the process of personal emergence. SAT suggests that individuals develop their crime propensities through the process of moral education and cognitive nurturing. These processes are affected by the environments in which individuals spend time, and so the levels of collective efficacy in an individual's family, neighbourhood, peer group and school will affect their crime propensity. For schools, this has two implications. The first implication is that schools with pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds may have higher average crime propensities amongst pupils, as these young people may have been exposed to more criminogenic settings throughout their life. The second implication for schools is that controlling for family, neighbourhood and peer group collective efficacy, individuals who attend collectively at schools with higher levels of collective efficacy should develop lower crime propensities. There is, however, an important caveat here. While SAT suggests that spending time in collectively efficacious environments should lead to the development of lower crime propensities, it does acknowledge that for some individuals this will not be enough, and in some cases intensive interventions may be needed, and these interventions should focus on things like developing self-control and moral education. It's probable that those who attend schools with a better range of effective behaviour interventions will develop a lower crime propensity thanks to the treatments they receive. And finally, by combining hypotheses 1, 2 and 3, I think we start to move towards a general theory of crime causation in schools. This model explains the key situational causes of school crime, but also how the school environment comes to have its moral context and how school pupils come to develop their individual traits. At the moment, this is just an early theory, so the next steps are further development of the theory, a development of a methodology, and then a development of a methodology to test the theory. Thank you. Any questions?
So we've now come to a close for this session. Are there any final comments or questions that anyone would like to share? Okay, if not, then that's the end of this session. Thank you very much for listening to all of us.